Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Michelle and today I want to tell you another dreadful story. Joachim Knychała was one of the most terrifying serial killers in a post-war Polish history. His case caused a stir not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but also because of the way he managed to evade the law enforcement for a very long time, despite the relatively small region of his doing, and using a similar modus operandi. And now I'm gonna tell you why Joachim Knychała is considered one of the most dangerous Polish criminals of the 20th century. Joachim Knychała was born in 1952 in Bytom, Upper Silesia. He was raised in a working-class and Protestant family in difficult financial circumstances, like many children in post-war Poland. Violence and harsh parenting methods were commonplace, which may have affected his psyche. Knychała himself claimed that he experienced trauma in childhood and that his relationship with his mother was supposedly cold and full of conflicts, which could have influenced his attitude towards women in the future. His father was Polish and his mother German. Knychała's grandmother couldn't forgive her daughter for the relationship with a Pole, and she transferred this hatred to little Joachim. He was constantly humiliated by her, and later by his mother. Both called him a Polish bastard. His peers also teased him because of his parents' different nationalities, giving him the nickname Schwa, which is a derogatory term for a German. He graduated from primary school in Bytom in 1967. Then he began studying at the basic vocational school in 1970, attained the profession of a minor carpenter. He settled in Piekary Śląskie and took up work at the Andalusia mine. In his youth, he was rather quiet, didn't stand out much among his peers. Some mentioned that he was introvert and had problems with establishing interpersonal relationships, which at some point turned into internal aggression and hatred. He grew up during the Polish People's Republic, a period of economic and social stagnation, which also had an impact on everyday life and the level of crime in the region. He embarked on a life of crime as a young man, and at the age of 18 he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for practicing in the rape of a young girl. He believed that this was unfair and that he had been framed by the girl. While serving the sentence, he developed strong grudge against women. His victims were women whom he usually encountered by chance, attacking them in the isolated places such as parks or paths leading through industrial areas. The attacks were brutal, sadistic in nature. Knychała began his series of murder in November 1974, when he made his third attempt murder. His would-be victim was 21-year-old Maria Borucka, whom he attacked on the staircase of a block of flats in Bytom. The woman was hit with great force in the back of the head, but thanks to a thick hat, the blow was not fatal. She also managed to see her attacker. The next attack, also in Bytom, took place on September 20th, 1975. The victim, Stefania M., died in hospital. Knychała was inspired by another vampire from Poland, who at the time was awaiting the death penalty. On May 6, 1976, 38-year-old Mirosława Sarnowska, the main witness in a murder case of the last victim of the vampire of Zagłębie, was murdered in Chorzów. Sarnowska recognizes Zdzisława Markwickiego as the perpetrator, among others, during identification. She was murdered in an identical manner to the victims of Vampire of Zagłębie, which was death as a result of being hit in the head with a blunt instrument lower parts of the body exposed. Then, on October the 30th, 1976, Teresa Rims was murdered in similar circumstances on the staircase of her house in Bytom. As she was returning from work, the woman died from blows to the head. The perpetrator dragged the victim's body to the basement. Despite the fact that the victim's house was opposite a police station, nothing was noticed. More attacks on women followed. On January the 20th, 1977, the perpetrator attacked Barbara in Siemianowice Śląskie, who also managed to see and remember the attacker. On February the 2nd, 1978 in Bytom, and July the 31st the same year, in an amusement park in Chorzów, he attacked two girls around 14 years old. Finally, the operation group was formed and called the Six, consisting of 7 experienced policemen. Based on the statements of the attacked women, a detailed composite portrait of the perpetrator and sculpture a mannequin were made. At the time, the militia had limited technical and scientific resources, which made it much more difficult to prosecute serial killers. Officers patrolled tram stops and took evening rides, hoping to find the attacker. Hundreds of men convicted of lewd acts were questioned. However, the perpetrator's grim streak continued. Another attack on a woman took place in March 1979. On June 23, 1979, a brutal murder took place in Piekary Śląskie. That day, the perpetrator attacked 2 10- and 11-year-old girls in the forest. He struck the victim several times with an axe, and the next day a random witness found the girls' naked bodies in the bushes. One of them was still alive. Despite receiving 27 blows to the head, doctors saved her. The operation group split into 2 subgroups, the Six, which continues to operate in Bytom, and the Frankenstein, which operates in Piekary Śląskie. Finally, in September 1979, Joachim Knychała was arrested for the first time as a suspect in a series of murders. Despite being recognized by one of the would-be victims, Barbara Rzepka, he had an irrefutable alibi because on the days when the murders were committed, he was listed on the attendance lists at the Andalusia mine. He was released despite a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the perpetrator. Political events in Poland and the introduction of martial law meant that the militia was more involved in the fight against the opposition. For 2 years the killer disappeared. Most likely, Knychała feared that he was being followed and stopped carrying out the attacks. In the 1970s and 1980s, social panic spread in Poland due to the growing number of brutal crimes. Initially, the media limited information about the murders, but over time reports about the vampire of Bytom began to appear in the press. Knychała became a legend, a terror to women and parents who feared for the safety of their daughters. At the time, the propaganda of the Polish People's Republic tried to marginalize the phenomenon of crime, which is why many details of his case were hidden from the public. The authorities avoid using the term serial killer, fearing that it could undermine the image of the country as a safe and stable place. However, even these actions weren't able to completely control the growing fear. After several years, on May the 8th, 1982, while walking in a remote area, Knychała murdered his own sister-in-law, 17-year-old Bogusława. This was his last murder. Initially, there was no indication that he was the perpetrator, especially since he himself notified the family and later the ambulance and the police about the sudden collapse of the woman who had died. However, a thorough examination of the victim's body conducted by specialists revealed that Knychała's sister-in-law died from a blow to the head with a blunt instrument, and traces of semen were found on her underwear. The location of the wound high on the skull was very unlikely to have been caused by an unfortunate fall. It turned out that Knychała had intercourse with his sister-in-law, which she eventually wanted to tell her sister about, and this became the motive for the murder. Joachim Knychała was finally arrested during his sister-in-law's funeral and transported directly from the cemetery to the police station. At first, he didn't confess to anything. He was subjected to polygraph tests. Knychała reacted very strongly to control questions about other murders. He lied not only about his sister-in-law, but also when asked critical questions about whether he had ever killed anyone in the past. When pressed during interrogations, he testified in detail about murders committed in the 1970s. During on-site visits, he gave facts that had never seen the light of the day. There was no doubt that Knychała was Frankenstein. The irrefutable alibi turned out to be a fiction. During interrogations, it turned out that Knychała expressed no remorse. He described his crimes in detail, speaking about them with distance, almost with cold calculation. The police and psychologists tried to understand the motives of his actions, whether he was guided by a mental illness or was simply a person completely devoid of empathy. During conversations with Knychała's lawyer, he claimed that he had a dual nature, that he knew he had to be punished, expressed remorse and confessed to the murders. He was ashamed of the sexual motive for the crimes, especially to his wife, because through all this time he was a very good husband and father, at least during the day. During one of the conversations, when at his wife's request he told her about the murders, concealing the fact of the rapes, his wife calmly told him, "You know, I wouldn't forgive you those girls. You should hang for that." He began writing memoirs, happy that he was recognized as the one of the biggest killer in the post-war era. He was pleased that he had become known and entered history. His trial aroused enormous public interest. In those days, serial killers were rarely tried, so Knychała became an unprecedented case. During the trial, numerous pieces of evidence of the crimes were presented, as well as testimonies from people who had contact with him at different times in their lives. Psychiatric experts ruled that Knychała was insane, but in the political circumstances of the time, severe punishment for a serial killer was inevitable. On April 19, 1984, Joachim Knychała was sentenced by the provincial court in Katowice to death by hanging for 5 murders. When he heard the verdict, he was calm. He expected it. In October 1984, the Supreme Court upheld the verdict. He attempted suicide twice in the detention center. He tried hard to get permission to see his children. He was visited by his mother and wife only. The provincial court in Katowice set the execution of the sentence for May 21, 1895 at 5:30 p.m. The sentence was carried out in a prison in Kraków and was one of the last cases of capital punishment in Poland before its official abolition in 1990s. Knychała was buried at the Prądnik Czerwony Cemetery in Kraków. His grave hasn't survived to this day. Joachim Knychała has become a permanent part of Polish criminal culture. His story was the inspiration for numerous books, reports, and documentaries that analyzed not only the crimes but also the psychology of this type of criminal. On the basis of Joachim Knychała's testimony, the book The Vampire Diaries by Eddie Kozak was written, which includes not only the accounts of the convicted person, but also the opinions of psychologists, police officers, and people who had personal contact with the murder. Joachim had children and a wife. According to psychologists, his behavior had a psychosexual subtext. In reality, he was afraid of women, and his negative attitude towards this sex was described at the beginning of the book. The murders that affected him the most concerned girls, whose death tormented him with terrible remorse because he constantly identified them with his own children. Knychała emphasized that he loved only his wife and presented himself as deeply rooted in love, in devotion to his family. Raised in pathological environment, he adopted negative patterns from childhood. And observing prostitution among his peers, he acquired an aversion to women. His favorite tool was, as he called it, his beloved axe, with which he committed his first murder on a young woman, hitting her in the back of the head. He claimed that only when he raped dead bodies and saw them massacred did he feel sexually fulfilled, and only then did he achieve satisfaction. He considered women to be provocateurs, the cause of every man's confusion. His attitude showed disgust and revulsion towards them. He was irritated by their behavior, physicality, and mentality. He only treated his wife with respect. Knychała became a dark symbol of the evil and brutality that can reside in a person who might seem ordinary. His case is a reminder that evil can take many forms and can hide where no one would suspect it. Please like and subscribe this channel to help me grow. And see you.